You all set? You good to go? Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's good to see you all. I think most of you know me. My name is Carl Pearson. I'm the Associate Director in the Center for the Study of the Middle East, which we affectionately call by its acronym SESAME. Today's talk is co-sponsored by the Inter-Asian and Uralic National Resource Center. Over the course of this academic year, the IAU, NRC, and SESAME have been working on promoting minority viewpoints in the Middle East in our public lectures. And although there are many, many millions of them, it's still the case that Kurds do represent minorities in the nations in which they live. So we're happy to present another in the series on minorities in the Middle East and Central Eurasia. A couple of points just before we start. There's a what are these called? UBC? No. QR code. Thank you very much. In front of you. The CIA has asked us to report everybody that's here, so if you just click on that, we'll send your name directly to the federal. No.
You got a room full of Middle Easterners. Please don't joke.
That is a survey. And if at the end of the talk, you would be so kind as to register your thoughts or feelings about today's event, we would appreciate that. So last thing I want to do before we start is I'd like to mention that IU, I believe, is the only institution in the United States of America that teaches Kurdish during the academic year. There are summer programs, and we wouldn't be able to do that without a Kurdish instructor. And so we are very pleased to be joined this year and in the coming years by Dr. Hawa Khalid. And Hawa was also instrumental in bringing our speaker today. So I just wanted to thank you personally for your help in organizing today's event, but also your dedication to Kurdish language instruction here at IU. We're very pleased. Thank you.
And development Kurdish materials.
We are also developing Kurdish curriculum materials.
Yes.
With the Center for Languages of the Central Eurasian Region. Yeah. Got it.
Thank you, Hiwa. We appreciate it too.
And we do both, by the way, Kurmanji and Sorani. We teach Sorani during the academic year and the summers. But we have developed Sorani and Kurmanji teaching materials with Selkar. So we've been at this for about a decade here at Indiana University, in fact. Thanks to our Title VI funds.
Yeah.
Thanks for everyone. All right, so without further ado then, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jaffer Sheyholislami. He's joining us today from Carleton University in Ottawa. He in fact joined us late last night from Ottawa. He is a specialist in applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, and language policy. And the title of his talk today is From Shame to Pride, From Assimilation to Standardization, Language Policy and Linguistic Rights in Kurdistan. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Carl. Allow me just take a minute or two to thank School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University, this beautiful campus you have. My God, it's incredible. Although I need to see more if you cooperates further. Also Center of the Study of the Middle East, Inter-Asian and Uralic National Resource Center. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Paul Pearson, for all the arrangement you have done, for your kind words. Thank you, Dr. Estarabadi. Thank you so much, Professor. And thank you, Dr. Hiwa. He picked me up at the airport. So kind.
You're a full-service center.
In Kurdistan, I've got used to this being picked up, but not in North America. That was my first treatment. Very nice, very kind. Thank you. So I will be talking about the Kurdish language And I literally mean that thing, what I said, from shame to pride, assimilation to officialization. And I will try to demonstrate this by talking about my own personal experience to some extent as well. A part of this shame and pride also involves the bonfire you can see, and the dancing and clapping around that fire. Because a couple of decades ago, that wouldn't have not been possible. It wasn't possible, but now it is possible. So it's not just language that has gone through this journey from shame to pride, but also the whole culture, overall Kurdish culture, language altogether. If you're like me, a student of Joshua Fishman, you will realize that it's almost impossible to separate language from culture and vice versa, because the culture may not have a chance to survive in, say, 4 or 5 generations without a language of its own. It may survive for a while, but then it will disappear. So what I'm talking about, where are the Kurds? Who are the Kurds? Well, just to be brief for the time being, those yellow dots are where the Kurds live, more or less. Of course, they're spread all over the world practically. So if you, for example, in Turkey, if you move towards west, of course, there are tens of thousands and millions of Kurds in Istanbul, in Ankara, and whatnot. In Iran, the same thing. If you go towards the east, towards the capitals, there are Kurds as well, of course. And in fact, in the much further east towards Afghanistan, there is a province called Khorasan, where about 2 million Kurds, 1.5 to 2 million, still live there, because during the Safavid Empire, they were sent there to protect, so to speak, the borders of Iran against some other tribes and nations who were attacking Iran. And then, so in the West as well, about 2 million. I'll give you a more precise estimate, perhaps. But why Kurdish? Well, because it's interesting and because it's my language. I can talk about my language. I have this right, I can. And actually, it's my bread and butter. That's another reason for talking about it. But it's really fascinating, and usually it is saturated with dichotomies when you talk about Kurdish. For example, Kurdish language still struggles for acceptability in Syria. And then suddenly you see the other headline: Syrian opposition allows Kurdish language courses at the university in northern Syria, or what is called these days by the Kurds in particular, Rojava. And it's not just Syria, Iraq. Iraq's Directorate General of Education in 2018. Teach our students the Kurdish language and cultivate the love and spirit of brotherhood between the various peoples in Iraq. Very nice gesture, very nice decree. Iraqi MP, member of parliament, calls for interpretation in Council of Representatives, which means, on the one hand, the Prime Minister directs, actually the Director of the General of Education, that was at his recommendation, to do this, teach Kurdish to everyone. In other words, theoretically, to treat Kurdish as a resource, not just a language, not a problem, not even as right, but further than that, as a resource, not just for the Kurds, but for the entire population of Iraq, which is really, doesn't happen in every country, but that's what's happening in Iraq to some extent. Like, for example, Kurdish in several high schools is the subject of, a subject, not medium of education, but a subject in several high schools in Mosul, which doesn't happen in many countries, by the way. But then, on the other hand, you cannot address the Iraqi parliament in Kurdish. So that's what the member of parliament at the time complains, that why we don't have interpreters. After all, Kurdish is an official language of the country according to the 2005 Constitution of Iraq, which is a legitimate complaint, especially coming from Canada. This is what we do in Canada: French and English. Anybody, anytime they could speak in that language. And in fact, recently, since the 2019 Indigenous Language Act, now, if somebody wants to talk in an indigenous language and address the parliament, as long as they can tell the House of Commons ahead of time, they can arrange for interpreters and they have the right to do so. So, but then the Kurdish language is removed from some signs of government offices in Kirkuk. So as soon as there is a political turmoil, then they take it out of language, good language. Sometimes it's not the focus of any conflict, any debate, any issue really, but then political debates, political conflicts are played around language. That's what happens with language. And around the same dichotomy, the same contradictions. On the one hand, on the left, you will see that new graduates from the BA program at the University of Kurdistan in Sanandaj or Sana in Kurdish. So far, about 100 students have graduated from that BA program since 2015-ish. But then on the other hand, you see Zara Mohammadi, a Kurdish teacher, being sentenced to 10 years, and then it was reduced to 5 years in prison for teaching Kurdish. In Turkey, TV gas is taken off. This is news I'm reading. I didn't make this up. TV gas is taken off the air for speaking Kurdish and was told, we're living in the Republic of Turkey and you need to speak proper Turkish. Prisoner penalized for speaking Kurdish with his mother. Recently, actually, in Iran, this thing happened as well. Apparently, a mother was denied to speak Kurdish to her son, who was arrested in the recent uprising of last year. And the excuse was, we as prisoner guards, we don't know what you're telling to your son. Which could be a legitimate, actually, complaint because they're responsible for the security of the place. But then they don't bother to get an interpreter. And they could get, just with a phone call, get interpreters, because after all, about 7-8 million Kurds are there. Elective Kurdish language classes to be offered in Turkish. And that's true, the truth too. In fact, now Kurdish is one of the elective courses that Kurdish kids could take in high schools. But high schools, that's the catch, not elementary school, not kindergarten, high school. You offer it at an age where they have already almost forgotten about their Kurdish, and they may not show much interest. It's too late. Often. So question, why so many contradictions? What are the language policies of the countries where Kurds live? How have these policies evolved over the past several decades? What socio-political and historical factors have motivated these policies? What impacts have these policies had on linguistic human rights? What are the prospects for the survival and progress of Kurdish language given these policies and all these contradictions? To delve into these inquiries within the next 40 minutes or so, I'm assuming I have about 40 minutes still, I propose a rather unconventional approach. I shall tell the tale of my life, recounting the multitude ways in which I've encountered my mother tongue, from shame in identifying with it to its revelation in print at a remote village, to facing repercussions for its usage, to eventually becoming a passionate language advocate and now a scholar activist in linguistics. As I open the pertinent chapters of my life's journey, I will interweave insights drawn from scholarly literature, of course, and I've already done so a little bit, such as critical language policy and planning, the nexus of language and identity, which is almost inescapable, and linguistic human rights, one of my passions, among others, of course. My aspiration is not only to impact these narratives, but also to convey a profound message, I think, one that underscores the transformative power of language, resilience of linguistic communities, and the imperative of linguistic diversity in our globalized world. And I'm so happy to be on this campus where I have noticed you are teaching and offering courses in so many minoritized and less taught languages. Really impressive. It makes me double happy for coming to this campus. Thank you. Through my personal odyssey and the lens of academic discourse, I aim to eliminate the enduring significance of language in shaping individual and collective identities, fostering social cohesion, and championing the rights of marginalized linguistic groups. Ultimately, I hope to inspire a deeper appreciation for the richness of linguistic heritage and a heightened awareness of the ongoing struggles and triumphs in the realm of language preservation and development. I had it written actually, but I didn't want you to see it. But now you see this beautiful picture. I took this in 2013, somewhere between on the border of Iran and Iraq. It's called Choman Valley. Dr. Hiwa, I was on top of Zozak Mountain when I took this picture. Incredible, beautiful. So what is Kurdish? Well, I think most of you know it's an Indo-European language belonging to the northwestern branch of the Iranic languages, very close to Persian, Baluchi, Pashto, Tati, all the Iranic languages, written in two scripts, Latin-based, and also modified Perso-Arabic script. And I guess that's the one Dr. Hiwa is teaching here, although he knows both, I know. He's well versed in both varieties. There are two standard varieties. Predominantly, Central Kurdish is spoken in Iran and Iraq, and Northern Kurdish, all parts of Kurdistan. That's one of the major differences between the two varieties. Northern Kurdish Kurmanji is in all parts of Kurdistan. Kurdish literary tradition often is asked about the language, and often sometimes, unfortunately, for those who are not aware of the tradition, they use this as an argument to say that, for example, Kurdish is not good enough for education because it doesn't have the vocabulary, it doesn't have the ability. It's just an invention of some Kurdish nationalists in recent decades. But the tradition of writing in Kurdish, especially in Harami and Gorani varieties, goes way back to the 14th century, Northern Kurdish to at least the 15th century, and Central Kurdish, it's more recent, the 19th century, although recently some texts have been revealed that goes further back. The first Kurdish newspaper was printed. It was called Kurdistan by Badr Khan and colleagues in 1898, my apologies. That should say 1898. 1918, the beginning of language planning, as Einar Hogan talks about it in the modernist sense, that you go through selection, codification, elaboration, all this business. It started in 1918 in Iraqi Kurdistan. 1930s, the first broadcasting, both in Yerevan, which was back then a part of the Soviet Union, but also in Baghdad. And then 1960s, the first Kurdish novel called Peshmerga by Rahim Saif Ghazi is published. I just wanted to show you a few historical dates that are quite significant in the development of Kurdish. So the population, can somebody recognize the image? Where is this from? What, the hook? The hook, yes. Thank you. Yes, and I took this in last November.
Yeah,
This recent
yeah.
November.
When I was there were no these like skyscrapers.
High rises, yeah.
High rises, no.
Yeah, nice, wonderful, beautiful city. So these are really rough estimates, and I think they're conservative to some extent for some Kurds. For me, they're okay. They work for me. Turkey, about 18 million, 18%, so 15 million, let's say. Iraq, 23%, 7 million. Iran, 10%, 8,500,000, Syria 7%, 2.5 million, the Caucasus about 500,000, and then diasporas about 1.5 million to 2 million, in total 35 million. However, there is a big however. These are the rough estimates of the population of the Kurds, people who identify themselves as ethnic Kurds, not the number of speakers. This is really important. Several studies in recent years have shown us, especially in Turkey, a large population, although they call themselves Kurd, but they cannot speak the language. Some may understand it, some may not, especially the younger generation. A few theoretical notions, and I'm sorry if it's a bit boring, but I have to get this out of the way so that you know what I'm talking about with the rest of my talk. Policies, I follow Bernard Spolsky. I find it quite useful. Language policy could be looked at in three parts. Language management, speaking about policies. Policies could be de jure, could be de facto. De jure is what's written, for example, in a country's constitution, but de facto is what is actually happening on the ground. So, and sometimes there could be quite a discrepancy between the two. Sometimes it's state sanctioned, for example, the constitution or a decree by the prime minister or what have not. But sometimes it is with some institutions. Some institutions even say factories they may have now in Europe, for example, in Germany, there are some factories where lots of Turkish speakers and Kurdish speakers work. They have some policies where they could use the language, how they could use it, how they could use three languages together in what circumstances. Sometimes institutions have their own policies. Perhaps this very university has its own language policy, I'm not sure. But sometimes families have policies. A long time ago, I had a Polish student from London, Ontario. The Polish community is quite large and very vibrant in London, Ontario. We have a London there. In London, Ontario. And he told me, for example, one of the rules, one of the policies in their household was that they could never speak a word of English at the dinner table. That was their policy. And it served them well. So some other people have policies like weird stuff, like some parents say, if you need something, you can only get it from me, honey, if you say it in your mother tongue. If it's in English, forget it. I'm not gonna give it to you. Now go find out, even if you have to use Google Translation, how to say it. So these are policies as well. How you manage language in a country, in an institution, but then also within the family environment. And then there are language practices. So policy is one side, but what happens exactly in a society? How do people use languages? What languages they choose? If I speak 3, 4, whatever languages, why am I speaking in English to you these days? And every once in a while, I may throw in a word of Kurdish or maybe Turkish or Persian. Why would I do that? All of these things speak to some sort of power relations, context. Everything is contextualized after all. And then these policies and also practices are influenced often and actually directed by language ideologies. What are language ideologies? All the beliefs that we have, especially those that are naturalized and we do not question anymore about language. French is beautiful. Really? Why? Linguistically, it doesn't have any particular, by any linguistic measure, that is more beautiful than English or German or Kurdish or Turkish or Persian. There is absolutely no linguistic criteria that could claim that could prove it. These are ideologies, especially these are ideologies that we do not question anymore. And that's really important to realize, because often some of my own Kurdish friends, they think, for example, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, they're all dialects of Kurdish. Kurdish was the language of Adam. I can prove it. Really? How? Well, if you give me a couple of months, I'll prove it to you. These ideologies do exist, and they're not constructive. Unfortunately, they're often destructive. And the other way around as well. Often these ideologies are used to deny minorities or minoritized groups language rights and human rights demands. Language dialect variety. Sometimes when I talk about Kurdish, some colleagues, some friends say, well, aren't there many Kurdish? Which Kurdish are you talking about? Yes, you got me there. Absolutely, you're right. Doesn't every language have varieties and dialects? I bet you many Americans can go to London and converse with someone with Cockney accent and won't have a clue what they're talking about, at least for quite some time, for a few days. Every language has dialects, every language has genres, accents, different pronunciations, regional features, and whatever. But also, one of the fields that concerns language dialect variety, this business, is sociolinguistics. To this day, there is not a solid method to distinguish the two. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. One of the oldest one is mutual intelligibility. Well, if two speakers speak their language and they can understand each other without switching to each other's language, we call them different languages. No, if they understand each other, dialects of the same language, my apologies. If they understand each other without switching to each other's language. Well, I have seen Norwegians and Swedes speaking their own language, perfectly understanding each other. Are they dialects? I'm not going there. I might be in trouble. No, they're languages. Why? Because, as Max Weinreich years ago told us, a language is a dialect with an army. There's a straight connection to politics. What is a language? What's a dialect? What's a variety? That's why sociolinguists settle for the term variety. They don't want to go to language and dialect often. That's safer. To respect also the wish of speakers of languages and dialects. Language and nation, of course, there is a strong connection. It's hard to deny it. Ernest Gellner told us without a centralized language, the UK we know today, the Britain we know today, or the France we know today couldn't have come to existence. Because all those people from Wales, Scotland, Ireland, came to London to work in a factory. How could they get along? How could they know what shift has been, what parts have been done, and how to continue this shift? Especially the time when the shift work started. Because you had to be able to read something. Okay, 5 parts are broken, 5 defect, and I am now taking over from you at 4 p.m. I know what to do. You can just leave. You don't have to stay behind and tell me every time, oh, don't touch this one because 2 hours ago, no, we don't have time for that. We can't stop this. It's in Chaplin's Modern Times. That's an example you can see. That's for Gellner. So very practical modernist approach. But then also for German Romantics, having a nation, to say you're a nation, but don't have the language of your own, and not just any language, a language of your own is contradiction in terms. That's what they believe. So they look at language as the soul of nation. Herder, Fichte, all of these German Romantics. But even for someone like Benedict Anderson, language is the thing, the medium where members of a nation who have not seen each other ever can imagine each other and feel that they belong to the same thing. Someone in Seattle, someone in Indianapolis, they might have never seen each other, yet they can imagine the same identity. And Anderson claimed this can only happen in language. But then it has to be a language, one language. If it's more than one, then we're talking about different things, not the modernist nation state that Gellner had in mind, that everything had to be congruent: culture, language, state, politics, army, economy, so on and so forth. So you can tell language diversity is a problem. When you look at these modernist definitions of nation, then having several languages, 30 languages worse, 50 languages really worse, 70 languages apparently, like Iran, it's really bad for nation building. So Richard Roos, an American scholar, in 1984 published a very influential paper. And he said, well, there are three ways to look at language, especially language diversity. You can look at it as a problem and then create lots of problems for yourself, as it has caused many problems and conflicts and bloodshed in Iran, in Turkey, in Iraq, in Syria, in Spain, and many other places. If not bloodshed, well, lots of oppression. Michael Billick tells us that in England, in around 1920s, when Britain was fighting for the Kurdish language right in Iraq, literally imposed it on the Iraqi assembly at the time through the British mandate. If a Scottish shepherd sang in Gaelic, British soldiers would have punished them. That's Michael Billick, it's not me. So that's nation state ideology for you. Now, this is what would happen if you look at it as a problem. But there are other options. You can look at language as a right. And when a population says, I want right to that language, to study in it, to speak in it, to write in it, then they should have the right. It's not easy. I'm not claiming it's an easy thing to do. It's challenging. But then every good thing on this planet, as far as I am concerned, is challenging and requires lots of thinking and creativity. It won't come easy. But also, to go further, you can look at the language as a resource for cultural preservation, as a resource for understanding the other, as a resource for making this social cohesion in a society and respecting each other. And then I finish with this one, language orientation towards minority languages. They could be prohibited. A state could be just quiet about the language, minority language. It could tolerate it, not to help them, just tolerate it. Don't persecute anybody if they use the language, but then don't help them either. Don't give them the taxpayers' money because it's as though they don't pay taxes. Of course they do, but no, don't give them, it's okay. And then expediency, when you respect the language of a minority, not because you want to protect the language, the minority language, but it's good for you. It's good for the majority to do so, at least for a while. That's expediency, that's following Wiley. And then promotion. Promotion is when you actively get involved and promote a language and then respect their linguistic rights. Why? Because having access to your mother tongue, to the language that you're comfortable with, is important for freedom of expression, for democratic participation, for better academic achievements, for greater social mobility, more stability in a country, an enhancement of the allegiance of linguistic minorities to the country they live in. But its denial, of course, as I said, often leads to either a quiet oppression or conflict and civil war. So we could play with this table. Maybe I will have time to go back to it, but all these theoretical notions could be put on this table. And if I couldn't do it, then I will give you a paper and then you can see it. So I was supposed to talk about myself. What happened to that? Well, about 60 years ago or so, well, actually exactly 1960, I was born in a village in that corner of northwestern Iran into a family of farmers. School, education, television, radio, everything was in Persian. So what do you think happened to me? Although I was from a village, I spoke Kurdish to my parents, of course, and to friends, but Persian was the language to look up to. It was the language of my stars. The language of the soccer players that I loved them. It was the language of cinema, of the beauty queens. It was the language of everything that I wished I was one of them for one day, for a second, for a minute, or if I could be one of them one day. It was the language of them. And what happens when you do that? Well, before going there, actually, yeah, exactly. That's it. So even although every once in a while I would wear Kurdish dress, especially if I visited my family in the village, but this is what happened, as Stephen May tells us, after about 40 years of working with Maori community in New Zealand. Stephen May says, if majority languages are consistently constructed as languages of wider communication, while minority languages are viewed as merely carriers of tradition or historical identity, it is not hard to see what might become of the latter. Minority languages will inevitably come to be viewed as delimited, perhaps even actively unhelpful languages, not only by others, but also often by the speakers of minority languages themselves. And this is where the shame comes from. When you don't see the language being spoken by your president, by your prime minister, by your movie stars, by your basketball players, and so on and so forth, can't be so proud of your language. That's what happens. So, what happened then? Why am I here talking about Kurdish? A miracle happened. I was almost looking like this. Well, actually, it is me, the one on the left. Very cool guy, quite Persianized, mentally, every sense, I guess. And then there was this few days, kind of my summer vacation. My parents said, oh, okay, you can leave the cows alone. We'll find somebody to look after them. Go to this cousin's village and stay there. And the cousin's village was Hemin, a national poet who was given the title national poet during the Kurdish Republic of 1946 in Mahabad, in my hometown. But he was in Iraq. He had fled the Shah at the time, and he was living in Iraq. But I went to that village. I had lots of Persian novels. Well, I guess not 100, but a couple. And then a few magazines, again, Persian, everything Persian. I ran out of them after a few days because usually at home it was quiet. Everybody was working on the farm, and I would be in that beautiful village, maybe sitting by a spring, and there are beautiful ones over there. And then one day I said, there has to be, this is Haman's house. There has to be something, another book for me to read. So in a dark closet in a corner, I found a little book that was collecting dust. It was called Mamuzin, but in Kurdish Sorani. Mamuzin is originally in Kurmanji. It was Mamuzin Khani Hajar Kurduye Mamuzin of Khani Hajar, a close friend of Haman, and that's why this book existed there, was there, has turned it into, it's hard to say translated because they're the same language, but from one dialect to the other, converted to this dialect. I brought it to light, gathered up the dust, and I started reading just this. Because it's different from Persian alphabet and Arabic alphabet. It is the same, the base is the alphabet, the script is the same, but the alphabet is different. Mamuzini Khani. I figured it out. It's Kurdish. How could it be? I have never seen Kurdish written in my entire life. Now, to go back to Stephen May's quote, my father was the first cousin of this national poet. He remembered the Kurdish Republic of 1946. politics, everything. But he never let us know at home about those things. Because he used to say, the walls have mice and mice have ears. So, don't say anything about the Shah and the state. And then years later, I discovered how I felt. Joshua Fishman says, the essence of a nationality is its spirit, its individuality, its soul. This soul is not only reflected and protected by the mother tongue, but in a sense, the mother tongue is itself an aspect of the soul, part of the soul, if not the soul made manifest. And then why print would do have such an impact on me, on a 15 years old boy in the middle of nowhere in this remote village. Well, Marshall McLuhan says, perhaps also the ability to see one's mother tongue in uniform and repeatable technological dress creates in the individual reader a feeling of unity. That's very much akin to Benedict Anderson. You can tell, I imagine community. Feeling of unity and power that he shares with all other readers of that tongue. So my question was literally, are there other people who read this? Where? Why am I seeing this the same for the first time? Where does this book come from? Lots of questions. My father said, don't ask. However, somebody helped me to discover a few answers to this question. One day, my brother, older brother, he knew in hiding I was teaching myself how to read and write in Kurdish. Came to me, he said, you know what, I have a friend whose father brings goods over the border illegally. He's a cross-border courier. But he got a book of our older cousin. Would you like to see it? I said, yes, please, where is this? And it was this book. Where? He said, well, I'll bring it to you, but we have some rules. You have to read to us on a daily basis because none of them could read any language, let alone Kurdish. You have to read to us, but then at night, so in the evenings, we'll bring it to you. You read to us for half an hour, whatever, and then we can leave it with you. And then in the morning, he was a cab driver. He would come and pick it up because he can't trust you with the book. And if something happens, then he'll be responsible and all that. So we don't want you to get into trouble. And we don't want anyone else to find out. So that's what I did. And every night that they left it with me, it was 300 and something pages. I hand wrote the entire thing. And when, I'll tell you, when he returns from Iraq in 1979, I gave it to him to sign it for me, and he started crying. He couldn't believe that I had handwritten the whole thing because I had to. I couldn't take it anywhere to photocopy. That would be in trouble. But one other thing I discovered when reading his book, besides his poems, which to this day remain very powerful and influential in the entire region, especially among the Kurds, I also learned this. In the introduction he wrote, I learned the Persian alphabet from a family tutor, Said Nakam, and was exposed to Kurdish literature. In 1927, when my father decided to send me to public school, I was excited. But the first day I was to school, I was terrified. The only language I knew was Kurdish, but no one dared to speak the language in school. I've experienced many cruel and difficult times in my life, but nothing as difficult as my first day in school. My teacher, who was a Kurd himself, berated me in Persian. I didn't understand him. My classmates laughed at me. I was extremely embarrassed. After that, I feared school so much that for a long time at night, I would hide under the blanket and cry. And in the morning, I would go to school, reluctantly. So, why this feeling of a national poet? Why this feeling of me? Why we couldn't study in our language? Well, that's Kurdish in Iran. In 1921, this modern nation state ideology kicks in Iran, and there is this idea of building a modern Iranian nation state with the constitutional revolution. Between 1925 to 45, Kurdish is practically banned in all formal settings, and writing in it, reading in it, extremely discouraged and quite dangerous. However, in Iran, it has never been written in the constitution that any language is banned. That's a difference compared to, for example, Turkey of the prior to 1990s. In 1945, the Republic that I already mentioned, short-lived, fragile Republic of Kurdistan in Ma'bad. During that one, it lasted for 11 months. Kurdish became the official language. And of course, Persian was still there, but they didn't have enough time to turn it into working language. So Persian was still there. Nonetheless, periodicals started to be published in it. It was started to be taught with the help of several teachers, actually from Iraqi Kurdistan, from Suleimania. They were there. And then 1946 to 79, what I have called this policy controlled and restricted tolerance, in the sense that you would have not been directly prisoned, say, for example, if you spoke Kurdish, or even if you were reading something and you found somehow, and even there were some bookstores that sold Kurdish books, actually, not many, just one in my hometown, for example. But then the rumors had it that actually the security service allowed that Kurdish guy to bring in some Kurdish books from Iraq so that they knew who would be reading Kurdish, because the minute they found that out, they would think that they're nationalists and they would be in trouble. So that's, in a nutshell, language policy. Again, this modern nation state ideology. In 79, Heman, my cousin, I'm going to repeat him several times until you remember his name. Heman, my older cousin. In Kurdish, it's a bit weird to say my cousin. I have to say I am his cousin because he was famous, the national poet. He's older than me, all respectable, all of this. But now I have to say my cousin. I came back to Mahabad, my hometown. Thousands and thousands welcomed him. You see that picture on the right, actually, is the day he came back. He's in that car, here on the car here. And the one in the little circle yellow to the top right, actually, it's me with this Kurdish turban on his head. I'm 18 over there. And that's me again. In 1980, I became a teaching assistant to Heman, my cousin, because not many people knew how to read and write in Kurdish. My generation, maybe 10 people in the entire city of about 50,000 population. That's how it was. So I would go to these huge auditoriums with hundreds and hundreds of people sitting there, wanting to learn Kurdish, how to read and write in Kurdish. And I was the assistant. So he would say, for example, he was by then quite aged, and he would say, so Jaffer, can you write this on the board? And it was a huge blackboard, and I would go and write. There were two people, actually. There was another gentleman my age. So that's what we did. Pride in the language started to rise because Kurds were in control of their region. The central government has fallen, and the military has not been back yet. There was some broadcasting in Kurdish. Many books came from Iraqi Kurdistan as it would be distributed among young people, especially. And there was some sort of negotiation between the Kurds and the central government. And on the list of their demands, the right to have mother tongue education was at the top of the list, not surprisingly. So I will skip this for now. How am I doing with time, Carl?
About 10 more minutes.
Very good. I don't think I can make it, but I'll make it work. The war broke out, and the Kurds left the region, the cities, sorry, went to the countryside, or went to Iraqi Kurdish region, Iraqi Kurdistan. And that's what I did, just for a short visit. I went to a town, border town called Qaladzeh. In Qaladzeh, the first thing I did, I went to a bookstore. It happened to be there, and I just walked in. And I said, do you have Mamoudzine? Because I remember that was the book that opened my eyes in that remote village. They said, no, sorry. And then one thing led to the other. They found out I was a cousin of the famous poet, him. They said, oh, we have a book of your uncle. I said, really? Which one? They had that book, Laments of Separation, Knowledge Judaic, had just been published back then. Of course, they didn't charge me once they found out Haman was my uncle. And I was quite happy about that because I had very little money with me. In Iraq, again, the dichotomy continued. Iraqi regime and the Kurds were at war with each other, but then, and there was some sort of so-called Arabization happening in Kirkuk and some regions, in even Hawler, some Kurdish schools shut down and all of this. But at the same time, compared especially to the neighboring countries, there was considerable positive linguistic rights actually. In places like Suleimania, which has been the hotbed of Kurdish nationalism, especially back then, since the actually 1920s, schools were in Kurdish from elementary all the way to, in fact, there was a university that had a Kurdish program. Later on, it was moved to Erbil. So why this? Well, it has a lot to do, I think already I mentioned, with the British mandate. When British went to Iraq, they didn't mind if Kurdish nationalism is stronger than it was. And they started publishing in Kurdish. In fact, the first Kurdish periodical in Suleimania was published by a British soldier, a British officer, Swan, Tegeshtani Rasti, understanding the truth. It doesn't mean that Kurdish identity was not there and Britain invented it. Please don't get me wrong. But they didn't mind if it had become stronger. However, when it became a bit too strong, they didn't like it, with the revolt of Sheikh Mahmoud, who declared himself the king of Kurdistan. And of course, they defeated him and they then sent him to exile. But in 1931, Britain literally imposed on the Iraqi assembly to approve what was called local languages law, by which minority languages, not just Kurdish, Turkmen, Syriac, Armenian, and many others, at least these three major ones, which were spoken in Kirkuk, in Erbil, and Mosul, had the right to do some administration in their language, but also have education in their language in regions where they lived. So that's quite old, and that tradition was there. In 70 to 74, it had minority official status when there was a truce between the central government and the Kurds. And then in the 80s, again, war broke out, as I just said, until 1991, when there is an autonomous region for the Kurds, where they become the Kurdish become official. In the 80s, when the war broke out between the Kurds and the central government in Iran, my cousin or my uncle took side with those who, the KDPI, the biggest political organization, split into two. It took side with the one that said, I am not going to, we don't think fighting with the central government is the answer. We should do our best to convince them to give us some rights, and let's do it peacefully. So he took side with that side, not with the fighter side. And he was given the commission to lead a Salahuddin publication in the town of Urumiyeh or Urmiyeh. the Kurdish, and started this magazine, Sirwa, Breeze, which influenced thousands of young people, taught them how to read and write in Kurdish. Although the political organizations called him in at the time by many negative names, unfortunately, but then years later, they realized how many thousands of Kurds who later on became fighters and language activists and quite prolific writers, poets, novelists, acknowledged the fact that they actually all learned Kurdish from that magazine, that at the time the political organizations frowned upon. In Turkey, I arrived in Turkey in 1987. I couldn't say that I was Kurdish. Because had I said that I was Kurdish, I had been told that I would have been deported back to Iran, and I didn't like that. So that's me over there with a bunch of other refugees, took refuge in Turkey and having a good time, actually. Some of them are smiling and laughing because it's a picnic, actually. It's not, we're not on the run. I think we're somewhere close to Kırşehir or Nevşehir, somewhere there, Central Anatolia. But that was not a good experience at the beginning. I had to deny my identity. I couldn't say who I was. And of course, it had roots. The Turkish Constitution of 1961 said, everyone bound to the Turkish state through the bond of citizenship is a Turk. So of course, there was no Kurdish, there was not a Kurd, so I couldn't be one. Turkish Constitution of 1962 reads, the mother tongue of all Turkish citizens is Turkish. I think that says it pretty much, that I couldn't say that my language was Kurdish. In fact, at the security center, security police center, Amniyat Sara, I was asked, because my ID card from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said Mahaba, place of birth. And my friends told me not to do that. Pick up something else. If you don't want to say you're Kurdish, then don't pick up a Kurdish town. Pick something else. Why do you insist? I couldn't pick another town. I said, I have to have something that I can't deny myself completely. Please let me keep this. So I kept Mahaba. So when they saw this, they said, so you're Kurdish? I said, no. They said, how come? So I came up with this story. I said, well, I was born in this town because my father was a banker. My father was a farmer. He was a banker, and he was the head of a bank in that town when I was born. It's not my fault. He was there, and the government sent him there, or the central bank sent him there for a service. So that's what happened. They said, so you know Kurdish? I said, I still remember a few words because we lived there for 3-4 years. I still know a few words. They said, such as, I said, Choni, Chaki, and it wasn't Kurmanji, it was Sorani. But anyhow, I still got the slap on the face. But I kept denying it, and I never said that I was Kurdish. So, these are some facts. How many villages' names have been changed in the 60s, 70s, 80s? Name of villages, name of places, name of people. And it all has to do with language. You change language when you do these things. Because what's in a name? A lot. I beg to differ with Shakespeare. There is a lot in it, quite a lot. So the case of Kurdish in Turkey, when I came to Canada and started studying linguistics, I was really, on the one hand, delighted, but then also surprised. It has found its way in so many linguistics, especially sociolinguistics textbooks, as a prime example of how a language could be prohibited in a society, following Basque and Catalonian and others. So for example, Susan Romain, 94, I was really shocked when I saw this, or Ronald Wardow, 1996, and so on and so forth. So I will spare you from this linguistic genocide thing. It could have been quite a discussion, but I skipped this one. Tulis Congress, Emir Hassanpour called the case in Turkey, and also to some extent in Syria, actually, linguistic genocide of the country. Because Tulis Congress claims that there are two items in the definition of genocide. One is causing serious bodily or mental harm. And she focuses on that one, mental harm. She claims if you ban someone from using their language, you are mentally harm them, or if you punish them because they speak a language. So you mentally harm them. And then forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So again, if you take away the language, if not one or two generations, the third generation, you can bet you've done a good job in transferring them to another group. So that's why it was called linguicide. It's a kind of a controversial issue, so let's just skip it, but it's good to mention it. I believe in it, actually. It's not that. But in Syria, it was the same thing, pretty much like Iran and Turkey, more like Turkey, really. The Kurdish identity was denied well onto the Arab Spring. During the French Mandate, up to 1960, 60-ish, it was okay. Because, in fact, there was some Kurdish activity. One of the most famous families of Badr Khan from Turkey, who were in exile in Syria, in fact, they started their major activities, like publishing the magazine Hawar in Syria. So it was okay, as long as the British mandate was there. But after that, Kurdish was banned, especially between 65 to 2011, and then there is Arab Spring. So in 88, I ended up in Canada. University of Toronto, the Metropolitan Library of Toronto, nowhere has a single page of Kurdish. I'm just saying this, look at the difference. It's not taught in this university. In 2018, we offered it at Carleton. Unfortunately, therefore, went through, but we did make it happen for the first time in Canada. And now taught in Exeter, University of Exeter, Uppsala for years, in Alcoy in Paris for years and decades. So, but then there was not a single page over there. And there was this major scholar, Professor Amir Hassanpour from UFT. I would borrow, he had a great collection of books and cassettes. I would borrow cassettes, music cassettes, and books and pamphlets, and I would copy them and then redistribute them among the Kurdish community. In the 90s, lots of things happened. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the new republics in the ex-Soviet Union, Turkey started opening up to minorities, especially acknowledging that, yes, we do have Kurds in this country. And then in Iran, there was some support for Kurdish, especially with the reformists when they came to power. Lots of Kurdish activities and a renaissance really in Kurdish culture and language for quite some time. Diaspora, I'll just say this in a nutshell. Many people say Kurds have no friends but the mountains. In my 2011 Palgrave Macmillan Kurdish Identity Discourse and New Media, I actually do say this phrase. Kurds have no friends but diasporas. And I believe to this day, one of their biggest friends is themselves and diasporas. How about today? Well, in Iraq, that girl on the right, in a television show, complains that why I cannot find a job with my mother tongue. Or if I want to find a job, I have to, and they mean English, I have to know English. So apparently English is taken over in Iraqi Kurdistan. That's one of the concerns. Challenges. Language policy, Joshua Fishman said years ago, don't touch it. If you start doing it, it never ends. So stay put and put up the fight. The gentleman also mentions that there are lots of signs in this country that don't have Kurdish, but they have Arabic, they have Turkish, they have English, but no Kurdish, and it's in the capital of the Kurdistan regional government. So there are these complaints in Iraq as well from the Kurds themselves. Nonetheless, the language, Kurdish and language diversity is not a problem. It's a right. And actually, as I said, to some extent, it's a resource. Even in Baghdad, so far, there have been a few attempts to offer Kurdish as a subject in schools over there. So that's a positive sign as well. In northern Syria, in Rojava, Kurdish is one of the official languages, but look at this democratic approach to language policy planning. In addition to Kurdish, Arabic, of course, is the language of the country, but also Syriac. They have official status in Rojava and the cantons of northern Syria. And the kids can send their families can send their children to Arabic school if they want to, Arabic medium school, or Syriac, or Kurdish medium schools. But Damascus still does not recognize Kurdish. In Iran, it's pretty much the same thing. Language ideologies are extremely powerful. The idea that everyone should abandon its language when it comes to formal setting, administration, major media, cinema, and most importantly, education. There is no place for other languages in those places. It's only Persian that should be there. And even though the recent government post 1979 have taken some, although one may call it tokenism, but nonetheless, they have taken some positive steps. For example, the BA program in Kurdish language and literature, the University of Kurdistan in Standardization. But there are still lots of it's hard to even label because sometimes they're really not Persian speakers, but they believe in this idea that Iran only means something as Iran if Persian remains the only and sole official language of the country. So Iran is nationalist ideology, Persian nationalist ideology. It's these ideologies that are the greatest obstacles. And unless there is some change in those ideologies, I'm not sure even any state could do anything about it, in all honesty. So language diversity is still viewed as a problem, and language shift, according to solid recent literature, actually published papers, it's real. But despite all this, language activism is incredible. It's everywhere. It's in private classes. People spend their own money, drive their own kids kilometers away to Kurdish classes. They pay teachers out of their own pocket. Their taxes goes to the state, but they have to pay for their own language, but they do it. And then social media, in most creative ways, they promote their language. They teach. This guy over there is teaching the alphabet. Another one on the right says, I am Lak, for example. And who says I'm not Kurdish? Of course I am Kurdish. The two girls up there, they compare each other's dialects. What do we say to this? And it's really fascinating. And what's so hopeful is that it's these young people that drive these activities and take pride in their language and culture. And that's most hopeful to me. In Turkey, language activism, a member of parliament dares to speak the language in the parliament, even their microphone is cut off, but they keep doing it, and it could actually have political consequences and prison and all this, but they keep doing it. Those kids are very proud to say Zamanim and Kurdiya, and they sing it. So you can take a look at this and figure this out while I wrap this up with this text. Okay. I try to really sum things up. Kurdish is the language of over 30 million people in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. And it's also spoken by first, second, or third generations of immigrants all over the world. However, Kurdish is a stateless, minoritized language that has been systematically suppressed and economically disadvantaged because there is a strong connection, according to François Gren, the great Swiss economist and applied linguist. With the exception of Iraq, where Kurdish has official status, the unsupportive language policies in other states with large Kurdish populations have traditionally limited speakers' opportunity to use Kurdish outside of the domestic sphere and has reduced scholarly interest in the language. Despite ongoing challenges, the study of Kurdish language, literature, and linguistics is now growing rapidly in the Middle East and especially in the West. Various geopolitical and cultural developments in the region have contributed to this growth. For instance, in 1992, the ban on Kurdish in Turkey was relaxed. In that same year, Kurdish became the official and working language in Iraqi Kurdistan. In 2005, Kurdish was enshrined in the Iraqi constitution as one of the official languages of that country. And in 2014, a BA in Kurdish language and literature was established in the University of Kurdistan in Iraq. Additionally, since 2013, Kurdish has been one of the official languages of the Kurdish region in northern Syria. And I've already mentioned in how many universities, the language, and the varieties, especially the two varieties, Kurmanji and Sorani, are offered in Europe and North America. And there are occasionally, summer institutes and things of that kind, like for example, with several colleagues, Professor Jeffrey Haig, Professor Erginopingen, and a few others, Dr. Michael Shyatt from the Library of Congress, was a great Kurdologist and Kurdish specialist. We run 2 weeks classes, full-time, packed every day from 8:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. at Bamberg, University of Bamberg, for 2 weeks. We had 32 students from all over the world. It was incredible, and thanks to the generous donations of those universities. But these things are growing, and should I be hopeful? This young lady is. So I am actually. And you may ask, so what happened to your cousin, to your uncle? Well, he passed away. Long time ago, actually. But a person who ran away because he wrote in Kurdish once upon a time and had for so many years and spent 11 years in exile in Iraq. This is what has happened to him. His house now is a museum for his work and other Kurdish poets. On the right down, that's the museum corner. Tons of statues of him in many, many, many towns and villages throughout Kurdistan, especially in Iran and Iraq. And then Dr. Hiwa knows how many locksmith even, locksmith of Haman, which I cannot see the connection, what happened for such a gentle poet and then a locksmith or mechanic of Haman. Lots of interesting names, especially in Iraqi Kurdistan, because in Iran still you cannot have signs in Kurdish. It has to be in Persian, even signs for your own shop. But that's the way it is. Thousands of kids are named after Haman. So I should be proud and I should be very happy actually and hopeful. Diasporas remain to be one of the greatest safe havens for Kurdish. So the Kurds have no friends but themselves and diasporas. And here are some of the activities. I was just talking to Dr. Hiwa. Once upon a time, I had to find that little book in a dark closet. And But now, right now, we can get online and go to a website. 16, I think, so far, 16 dictionaries have been typed up, and there is this corpus. You want to know what a Kurdish word means. 16 major dictionaries, all typed up, put into a corpus, and it searches all of them and give you something. It's almost like the English Online Dictionary. It's incredible, the difference. And you may ask, so what happened to that book that I found? Well, that's the book. But then since then, it keeps coming out with different editions and versions, and even in different dialects, and even in English. So how could not anyone be hopeful? So I'm hopeful. Thank you so much.